Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of Humanity Now podcast. This is Anarchism Part 2 with Daniel Norman. Today, we're going to recap what we talked about in the first part, and I'm going to start it off by reading from Alexander Berkman's book, ABCs on Anarchism. He writes, Anarchism, in the fewest words, anarchism teaches that we can live in a society where there is no compulsion of any kind. A life without compulsion naturally means liberty. It means freedom from being forced or coerced, a chance to lead the life that suits you best. You cannot lead such a life unless you do away with the institutions that curtail your liberty and interfere with your life, the conditions that compels you to act differently from the way you would like to. I like that passage from his book. Thank you for joining us, Daniel. Uh, can we
Thanks for having
please
me on
review?
again.
Yes, thank you. Can we please review some of the concepts of anarchism that we spoke about in part one? We can
So,
just briefly, go through the list.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, in part one, we were discussing what the general concept of anarchism is and how it emerged as an ideology in the course of the last couple hundred years, how it relates to other schools of political thought. And I like to summarize anarchism as the simple recognition that power, concentrated authority, hierarchy is self reinforcing, and seeks to self justify. Those in power will never stop coming up with rationalizations, maybe even to some plausible sounding rationalizations for why it's necessary and good that they occupy the position of authority that they do. Yet, when we look back at the vast past of human history, we see so many examples of positions and institutions of authority and power that today have 0% justification under our modern morality. It was once the case, for instance, in the United States, that you might get people saying, with regard to slavery, oh, I'm sure there are some bad slave owners who are abusive to their slaves, but the institution of slavery as a whole is still necessary because different races of people are different. It's for the own good of the slaves, whatever their rationalizations were. Not one rationalization of the so-called moderates back then holds any weight today. We have moved on in our morality. And the anarchist looks to that past and what has happened to previous institutions of hierarchy and authority and simply says, what are the odds that forms of inequality, hierarchy, and authority in society today will someday equally be seen as unjust as the ones that we today see as unjust? And how can we always be actively in the process of criticizing and tearing down structures of authority? Because structures of authority limit the possibility for life and happiness and flourishing for those who the structures of authority keep down. And also, while they empower some people, those at the top, those with wealth, those with connections, those who can order the imprisonment and killing of others, while the hierarchies give those people surface level power, maybe they're not even good for those people in a more um, spiritual or existential sense, in that it disconnects the people from at the top from the rest of humanity, from understanding and being able to be one with the rest of the species they are part of by separating people into these categories. So anarchists universally see forms of hierarchy as unjust, as not rising to the level of morally excusing themselves and giving rationale for why they exist. And the anarchist will always persistently, annoyingly be the person criticizing and taking things one step forward in the questioning of authority. So now we come to our modern world here. And anarchists would say that, just to start off on something very moderate, that should be very non-controversial, hopefully, for most people listening. Anarchists would say that so long as we are going to live in a world with nations, with governments, it would certainly be better for those nations and governments to have restrictions on what those in power can do rather than having no restrictions. It would certainly be better for those nations and governments to give their people some say in the form of democracy than having no say. It would certainly be better for all people to be treated equally under the system of laws than we have than for the laws to explicitly favor some people over others. Now, all of that probably doesn't sound very radical, but it is. These are very recent developments within human history. These principles of limited democracy, representative government, equality under the law are not universally implemented around the world. They're not even really implemented fully in the countries which claim to have implemented them. And even within the countries that claim to be constitutional representative democracies with equal rights for all, those principles are constantly under attack by reactionary forces. So these are not universal principles. The fight has not even been won by any means completely on this front. But if you live in many countries around the world today and you're not an extreme reactionary, you probably take it as default that you're supposed to say things like the laws should be just and equal for all people. But again, this is an extremely recent development within history. And we can remind ourselves that not too long ago, even when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, he was not yet in favor of an equal right to marriage for homosexual couples. And he was seen at the time as a very progressive, forward thinking, hope and change type of candidate. And he still, when he was first elected, needed to do some evolving on the topic of gay marriage. Um, and now that is a position that just within our lifetimes that we have seen in a lot of countries, a majority of people flip on of what their position is on it. So I think that people who want to hold beliefs that they see as just and moral about fair treatment for all within a society need to look back and ask themselves who were the people championing those causes when it was not the majority position, when it was not popular, when it was only a minority of people, a very small fringe sticking up for the rights of groups that had been marginalized and discriminated against. You know, who was it who was standing up for marriage equality or for civil rights and the end of segregation or for the end of slavery before everybody else was, who was willing to be out on the edge of that when it was an unsafe and unpopular position to hold that we should end some form of discrimination and inequality against a certain group of people. And what you will find is, in all cases, disproportionately, there were a lot of anarchists on that leading edge of all of these social movements. So I think if people take the moral claims that they hold to today, when it's safe to hold those claims, if they live in a place where a majority of people hold to those principles that racism, sexism, bigotry are generally wrong, they should ask themselves who were the people who were motivated to take up these fights at the beginning when very other few people were willing to do so, and what did those people believe? And what are those people saying now? What are the people on the edge of the fight for greater social equality saying? And if we look at things that anarchists today believe, that I think is going to make a lot of people who are just simply progressive or liberal very uncomfortable. It is statements like the entire institution of nations, the entire institution of governments, the entire institution of property is unjust in the way that it empowers some people over others. So I think that those couple topics I just brought up is a great place to dive into in talking about what do anarchists want today? What are they fighting for? Where do they see the fight for broader social equality amongst all people and the end of unjust hierarchies going in the future? And I'd be happy to start getting into those.
Excellent. Okay. I wanted to continue with another question
Great.
about anarchism in the global issues and
Mhm.
how anarchism approaches global problems.
Yeah. So let's take one major global problem today, which is the existence of stateless people, the existence of refugees and migrants around the world. Not everyone has a nation to call home. Not everyone has passports and citizenship documents to show what country they belong to, regardless of how long it is that they've actually lived in the place they live. All around the world, governments will take entire groups of people, regardless of how long they've lived within the physical territory of a nation, and say, well, these people aren't really citizens of the nation. Maybe this discrimination is based on ethnicity or religion or something else. But regardless, there's lots of people who have been rejected and cast out of the entire system of nations. If we look at the world map, every square inch of land today is carved up by the borders of nations. Yet the real purpose of borders is not to simply separate people in one nation from people in another nation. It is to separate the people who have a nation to call home from the people who are homeless with respect to any nation. And when we look at the pileup of refugees and migrants at borders, and we think about the treatment that they are subjected to, thrown into detention centers, families separated, we get people making excuses for this, saying they're illegal migrants, they shouldn't be coming here without documentation, they have quote unquote no right to be here. Yet, if I, as an American with a passport and a birth certificate and citizenship documents, want to go around the world, I can get a visa to travel quite easily. So, we have a system in which, if you already belong to one nation, you can quite easily, relatively easily, depending on what nation you're from, get permission to go visit, relocate, live in, maybe even apply for dual citizenship in other nations. But the people who don't have any nation are then most barred from being entered and accepted into any. So this is a massive dividing line in the world today. If you already have citizenship documents, you can get a travel visa. If you have no nation to call home, then almost no nation will want to take you in as a guest. And anarchists look at this situation and call it completely illegitimate and call out the existence of national borders as something that we have made up as human beings. And to whatever extent it is a practical and necessary reality that some people believe it is to have nations and to have borders, anarchists would say that this imaginary institution, that being nations, is not moral justification for the way we treat people who do not have a nation. So anarchists are always going to be very strongly on the side of and showing support for people who do not have official papers, but are trying to live wherever they are trying to live, wherever they find themselves, wherever they are trying to travel to. One of the most immediate and tangible goals and activities of anarchist is to push for the rights of the people around the world who don't officially have any rights, to push for the right of all people to freely and peacefully migrate and cross borders and reunite with families and try to create a home and a community for themselves. And anarchists form into networks and organizations of activists around the world um, to try to act in solidarity for with the most victimized nationless people of the world. This can be through it can be through political campaigning, it can be through legal support, and it can also be through physical direct action. If there are encampments of migrants and the encampment is facing violent eviction by the authorities of some state, that is where you will see anarchists coming and locking arms and building barricades and trying to prevent the violent eviction of people who have nowhere else to go. Because anarchists do not respect the imaginary institution of the nation to the point that they believe that it gives some people permission to act violently against other groups of people, and believe that we need to be in support of, in every practical way we can, with the people who have the least in the world, who have nothing in the world right now, and generally push for a world of free movement, free relocation, free right to live where you find yourself living for all people, regardless of documentation. Um, uh, yeah. So that's
That's
one way in
excellent.
which anarchists
Okay,
are pushing
I'm
back
gonna
against the logic of the nation state.
right. Excellent. That segues nicely into my next question of what in general do you what do anarchist society look like?
So so to segue from that, how do we move towards an anarchist society? So still within the realm of nations are going to continue to exist for some period of time. Anarchists are working to soften the violence and the brutality, of those nations by what I was just describing, which is acting in solidarity, both within legal channels and within channels outside the law, to support the people who have been left out in the cold by the entire system of nations. And I should also add to that, exact ditto for the parallel situation of houseless people within the world, people who do not have homes. Um, Someone who does not have a home to go back to, when a group of people who own no property, have no place to sleep at night, take up residence in an abandoned building, squat within an abandoned building, try their best to stabilize their lives and build a little community in a structure or in a collection of tents or something where they're trying not to bother other people and just find some safe shelter where they can. What do they get for that? The police come in and beat them up and destroy their possessions and violently evict them from their encampment, maybe send them to jail or drive them over the county line, drop them off somewhere to be some other municipality's quote unquote problem. So this is another example of how we treat people as less than human within our society, just because they don't own property, just because they don't have a place to go, just because they don't have official identification of who they are. Anarchists are always going to side and try to support these people who have been left out of the institutions of our society against the violence that is inflicted upon them because they have been left out. The punishment for barely having anything is to have what little you have destroyed. That is the logic of how we treat the unhoused in our current society. So anarchists are in all sorts of different ways in activist networks, trying to support the most marginalized and decrease and fight against the violence of nations and the violence of the state in enforcing borders, boundaries, the lines of property at the expense of incredible violence against marginalized groups of people. Anarchists would like to soften up nations in this way by supporting the most vulnerable. And then, as another step beyond that, anarchists are typically very supportive of movements for regional autonomy around the world.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of regions, cities, provinces, local governments where communities feel that they are not being served well at all by the centralized authorities of the national government, of the federal government. Now, anarchists are not believers in secessionism, in the sense that secessionism says that we should carve up existing nations into smaller nations. But as I've just described, anarchists see the process of drawing and enforcing borders as an inherently violent and unjust process in and of itself. So they're not saying that more national borders should be drawn to carve up existing nations, but that given the existence of nations as they are today, wherever there is a community of people who is saying we are discriminated against, we are being failed by the current government up top, and we think that we could do a better job with our own safety, our own policing, our own taxation and services if we were allowed a greater degree of autonomy to manage our own affairs. Anarchists are universally going to be in favor of those movements of softening and weakening the power of centralized governments in favor of giving every community more latitude to chart its own path. Now, there's obviously big things. There's massive infrastructure and stuff, and this is why I made it clear that we're not secessionists. We're not saying, build more walls to cut across roadways and disconnect power lines and stuff like that. We understand that we live in a big, complex society that forces large groups of people to work together. But anarchists would push for a much greater principle of live and let live. And wherever there is a local region that is saying that they believe that with a greater degree of autonomy, they could manage their own affairs better, we should be supportive of that. That if the only reason for a central or federal government to crack down on a movement for local autonomy is simply that it threatens the power of the central government, that is illegitimate. If central governments have any role in the world, it should ideally be to support and nurture attempts of self-governance on the local level. Anarchists would ideally like to see people up top who see their role as being supportive towards initiatives for self-governance in the local area, rather than people up top who see their role as crushing initiatives for self-governance down below. So this is all still definitely within the category of reform, of ways of softening what we think of as nations today. But ideally, anarchists would hope for a complete dissolution of all nations, a complete elimination of all national borders, and an uninterrupted tapestry network of semi self-governing communities cooperatively engaging with each other, where the entire world finds itself as a single community of communities, without any single central pinnacle of power over the whole world, or the local ones within each nation that then like carve up a chunk of the world and say, we're sovereign here and we have absolute authority within this local area. Anarchists imagine a very horizontal system where there is a lot of interaction and deals and social contract and collaboration happening between one community and the next community in a mutual, equal way. And these connections spreading globally across what today are militarized national borders.
That's excellent, Daniel. I think we'll wrap up today's podcast on that note, because that's the most important note of the world that we will have, that we will create, will be we'll have freedom. Okay, cool. Thank you.
I think if you want to just take another 5-10 minutes on this one, a good other thing to talk about briefly would just be, how do anarchists view changes that could be made in the economic sphere with corporations? This is something we could talk a lot more about in the future, but I think it might be good just to touch on it right here.
Sure, if you want to talk about it.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Beginning to paint a picture of what it would mean to move towards an anarchist world.
Okay.
Not necessarily what the end stage is, and nothing I am saying in any way I am claiming any anarchist would call the trademark anarchism, but I am describing things that, in my observation of spending a lot of time researching, discussing, thinking about these things with other anarchists, things that all anarchists seem to universally believe would be a positive direction for the world to go in. So I've talked a lot about how to soften up um, the power of the nation state today. Now, we do have representative democracy in a lot of major nations around the world. And one thing that anarchists would like is a move from representative democracy to more direct democracy. They point out that the system of democracy we have is very unengaging. You know, you come and you vote a few times a year, and then the politician goes off and is it's very hard to keep politicians accountable to the people because the people are not involved in the political process on a weekly, on a daily, on an hourly timescale. So one of the things anarchists would like is more direct democracy and more emphasis on keeping people engaged rather than passively clicking for a party they like and then tuning out, which is what the system's designed for today, keeping people engaged in the political process, in their civic responsibilities to think about what's happening within their communities and have input all the time. But another issue with the political system we have today is that regardless of who people vote for, we all know very clearly that the politicians are overly beholden to a small group of incredibly wealthy elites who have tremendously disproportionate sway over how our political system works. So, when we talk about the problem of wealth inequality, there is a spillover effect from that into the political domain. The extreme wealth inequality becomes extreme political inequality because those with incredible amounts of wealth have disproportionate influence over how our politics works, and everybody knows that. So, how do we deal with extreme wealth inequality? Well, the answer is not simply to have the government take wealth from some people and redistribute it to others. Um, People with a lot of wealth would like you to believe that that is the only possibility because then they can fearmonger about that redistribution just being another avenue for government corruption or government abuse, which is, a real concern. That totally accurate. So we need to imagine what a more economically equal society would look like that does not rely on the government to be a redistributor of wealth. So let's go to the source of wealth inequality. Why is there so much wealth inequality within society? It's because a very few number of people own the companies and rake in the profits, while the vast majority of people work for those companies living on subsistence salaries. Anarchists see the hierarchy, the authority discrepancy, the power imbalance between bosses, owners, employers versus their employees as a morally inexcusable situation. Just another example of a self serving, self justifying hierarchy. Bosses are in a position to determine how they should treat their workforces, and they could give their employees more power and more say within the companies. They choose not to, and they choose not to for purely self-serving reasons, and also reasons of bigotry, that they have to feel that their employees are, lesser than themselves to justify why they have the right to rule over their employees. So as long as we are going to continue to have companies and corporations in the form that we see them in the world today, anarchists would universally say better for those companies to give employees say, to have the employees have votes and control and power within the direction of the companies, to address the issue of extreme wealth inequality at the source by addressing the power discrepancy between bosses and employees, by, for instance, making the boss an elected position that the employees would get to choose, by giving employees ownership stake within the company. ultimately by converting all companies into worker-controlled cooperatives. So that is a radical but tangible within the world we have today goal that anarchists are actively pushing for on a lot of fronts. And I think it'd be something good to get into in the next episode. I'd like to wrap up in the next minute. But this is really at the heart of many things that anarchists are struggling for today, because both the immediate issue of the hierarchy within corporations, within companies, anarchists see as unjust. They would prefer for companies to give employees say and voice and power and control and votes in whatever form it comes in within those companies. And then there's a secondary effect, which is that the massive amount of wealth in the hands of so few, which is only possible because companies are run like a dictatorship where the employees have so little power and receive so little compensation relative to how much wealth they generate through their labor. That wealth concentration is then the major source of corruption within our politics. So, pushing for companies to transition towards employee ownership and employee control is very much killing two birds with one stone in the anarchist mind. It is the one of the important parts of the way forward for addressing the problem of wealth inequality, both in terms of the effects that it has on our politics and in terms of the immediate unjustness of just the daily experience of the way bosses are allowed to control and bully and exploit their employees. I think that's a great point to end things on. We'll pick it up next time.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniel. Okay,
Thank you.
we'll continue next time. Have a nice day.
Great to be back on. Bye.
Bye.